Welcome to Enigma Abierto. A cryptic message, a village of secrets, and a truth no one dares to speak. Where are you joining us from? Let us know in the comments. Now, pour yourself something warm, and let the mystery begin. The roses at Colonel Easterbrook's lawn were in full bloom, glowing with a crimson so deep that several ladies had remarked they looked almost indecent. It was the sort of remark one expected at a garden party in St. Mary Mead, amused, half scandalized, and entirely inconsequential. The village's most respectable citizens had gathered beneath a blue summer sky, sipping lemonade and remarking upon the weather with the earnestness of diplomats. Mrs. Bantry, in her broad straw hat trimmed with pale ribbons, fluttered from group to group, carrying snippets of gossip like a bee dusted with too much pollen. Major Harper was expounding loudly about his time in India, while Miss Hartnell muttered darkly about the parish council's latest foolish expenditure. It was, in short, a day very much like any other. Seated a little apart, Miss Jane Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap and observed the proceedings with those mild blue eyes that saw far more than they revealed. She noted with interest that Mrs. Price Ridley, usually the very model of decorum, had been speaking with unusual warmth to Mr. Leonard Copley, the new clerk at the post office. And wasn't it curious, she thought, that Mrs. Price Ridley's daughter had flushed rather violently each time she glanced toward them. The hum of conversation was broken when the postman, puffing and perspiring under the sun, entered the colonel's garden with an envelope clutched tightly in his hand. His appearance at such a gathering caused a small ripple of surprise. Deliveries were not the sort of thing one expected at a formal party. "A telegram, Colonel," the man said, slightly breathless. Marked urgently. There was a stir for telegrams. Those stark heralds of birth, death, and catastrophe were rarely associated with anything pleasant. The colonel, eyebrows bristling, took the envelope and, after a moment's hesitation, slit it open with his pocket knife. The crowd waited, half curious, half fearful. His eyes scanned the page, widened, and then, in a most uncharacteristic lapse of military dignity, the colonel staggered backward. The telegram slipped from his hand and fluttered to the ground like a wounded bird. Mrs. Bantry gave a little cry, and Major Harper leapt forward to steady him, but it was too late. Colonel Easterbrook collapsed among his roses, the crimson petals nodding mockingly about his face. A hush fell upon the party, broken only by the shrill, unmistakable scream of Mrs. Price Ridley. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her expression one of quiet sadness, though her eyes never left the telegram lying on the grass. For it was not the colonel's sudden death alone that drew her attention, but the strange silken ribbon that bound the message as an unnecessary flourish, out of place in such practical communication. She bent gently, her gloved fingers brushing the paper, and thought to herself that Saint Mary Mead was about to endure another season of whispered theories and concealed truths. Human nature, after all, was never so neatly arranged as roses in a garden bed. And somewhere, hidden behind polite smiles and sunlit chatter, lay the hand that had guided the colonel to his fall. Shock clung to the garden party like the heavy scent of the roses, suffocating and sweet all at once. For several moments after Colonel Easterbrook fell, there was only the sound of Mrs. Price Ridley's cry and the whisper of summer wind through the hedges. Then, like water released from a dam, voices broke out in gasps, questions, and hurried exclamations. "Fetch Dr. Haydock at once," commanded Major Harper, his own voice unsteady though he stood erect with soldierly authority. Someone ran quickly. A young maid from the colonel's household, who had been serving lemonade at a side table, gathered her skirts and bolted toward the gate. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bantry, flustered but practical, bent over the colonel's motionless figure. "He is cold already," she murmured, then pressed her lips together as though realizing she ought not to have said such a thing aloud. It was Miss Marple who, without fuss, gently closed the colonel's eyes, her small gesture oddly dignified amidst the confusion. She had seen death before, though rarely so abrupt. Her gaze lingered, not on the body, but on the telegram lying in the grass, that odd velvet ribbon still wound about it. By the time Dr. Haydock arrived, brisk and ruddy from the walk, most of the guests had recovered sufficiently to form little clusters about the garden, whispering in tones that could scarcely be called discreet. The doctor knelt, examined briefly, and shook his head with a finality that left no room for doubt. "Gone," he said simply. "A seizure, perhaps, or the heart." I warned him more than once about overexertion. This pronouncement should have quieted the crowd, but in truth it gave license to fresh speculation. "Seizure, did you hear that?" Miss Hartnell said sharply to Mrs. Price Ridley, who was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. And yet he looked at the picture of health not 10 minutes ago. Positively ruddy, I thought. "Telegram," muttered Mr. Leonard Copley, the clerk, his usually neat hair ruffled by the warm breeze. "Telegram came just before, did it not? You don't suppose, well, bad news can do dreadful things to the heart." "Bad news, perhaps," Major Harper growled, "but what was so urgent it must be sent in the middle of a summer afternoon?" Mrs. Bantry gave a shiver. "It looked strange to me. That ribbon like something from a lady's writing desk. Why would anyone tie up a telegram so?" The more they spoke, the more agitated they became, each repeating his or her own observation with an air of self-importance. To some, the telegram was merely a curiosity. To others, it was the key to the mystery. Yet none, it seemed, had the patience to examine matters quietly. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had returned to her chair and sat as though weary, her knitting bag resting neatly beside her. In truth, she was listening with the deepest attention, storing away each remark in each face. Mrs. Price Ridley's tears appeared genuine enough, yet Miss Marple noted that the lady's daughter, a pale girl named Edith, seemed more embarrassed than grieved. She stood stiffly apart, her gaze fixed not upon the colonel but upon the ground, as though hoping to disappear altogether. Later that evening, as the village gathered in smaller knots about their tea tables and hearths, the story spread with the swift inevitability of fire through dry straw. At the Blue Boar Inn, the patrons debated whether poison had slipped into the colonel's lemonade. At the post office, a queue of villagers lingered longer than necessary, each pressing Mr. Copley for details of the mysterious telegram. "It must have been from abroad," declared Mrs. Price Ridley with the solemnity of one who had given the matter great thought. "Perhaps something to do with his nephew in Ceylon. I always said those foreign postings were risky." "Nonsense," retorted Miss Hartnell, overhearing. "It was the shock of scandal, that's what it was. I would not be surprised to learn the colonel had some entanglement. Men of his age often do." Such remarks grew bolder as the daylight faded, each villager emboldened by the thrill of possessing knowledge, or at least the appearance of it. By candlelight and lamplight, the colonel's death became a puzzle to be solved over cups of tea and slices of seed cake. Each new whisper carried a sharper edge. Through it all, Miss Marple walked quietly through the lanes of Saint Mary Mead, stopping here and there to pass the time with a neighbor or inquire gently after a household. She never asked directly about the telegram or the colonel's affairs, yet somehow each conversation revealed a little more. Mr. Copley, for instance, let slip that telegrams with decorative bindings were most irregular. He had never seen one before and could not imagine from which office it might have originated. The following morning, Inspector Slack arrived from the county station. He was brisk, efficient, and not at all inclined to heed the murmurs of villagers. His presence at the colonel's house drew many onlookers who hovered in the lane, eager for any crumb of official information. "Well, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bantry said as she encountered her old friend near the vicarage, "what do you make of it?" "The colonel went so suddenly, and that dreadful telegram will be the talk of the county." Miss Marple's expression was one of mild concern, as though the whole matter distressed her beyond measure. It is always a sad thing when life ends in such a public fashion. She said gently, But one must not leap to conclusions. People often do, you know. They see what they wish to see. Mrs. Bantry sighed. You are right, of course. Still, I cannot help feeling there is something, well, unnatural about it. As if the Colonel's end was written in that paper before he even opened it. Miss Marple said nothing, only patted her friend's hand and looked thoughtfully down the lane where Inspector Slack's figure moved briskly from doorway to doorway. By evening, theories had multiplied beyond counting. Some swore the Colonel had enemies from his days in service, others that financial troubles must have driven him to despair. And yet, beneath all the noise, Miss Marple sensed a current of fear. It was in the way Mrs. Price Ridley avoided the eyes of her neighbors, in Edith's nervous glances toward the post office, and even in Major Harper's sudden bursts of temper. The village, for all its gossip, was unsettled. Something had been stirred up that touched more than one household. Miss Marple, seated once again by her parlor window with her knitting needles flashing in the lamplight, reflected that human beings rarely lied without leaving a little truth behind them. And somewhere, hidden amidst the chatter of the day, she had already begun to hear the faintest threads of that truth. Threads that, if followed with patience, might lead to the hand that had tied a velvet ribbon around a telegram and set in motion the death of Colonel Easterbrook. Inspector Slack prided himself on being a practical man. He distrusted village chatter with its meandering stories and embroidered truths, preferring the neatness of statements taken down in proper order. By the third morning after Colonel Easterbrook's collapse, he had already filled several pages of his notebook, though much of it was padded with contradictions and half-baked theories. The Colonel's body had been examined, and Dr. Haydock had written his report with professional caution. Heart failure, quite possibly aggravated by shock, it read. Yet even the doctor admitted privately that the suddenness of the attack was troubling. A robust man like the Colonel does not simply fall down dead without some cause, he told Slack in a tone that suggested he was unwilling to put it more formally. Slack, however, had his eye on the telegram. It had been retrieved from the grass, the velvet ribbon carefully preserved as evidence. He turned it over now in his hands at the Colonel's study desk, frowning at the florid cursive that read only a few terse words. Come at once. Matter of life and death. There was no signature, no origin stamped at the top, nothing that resembled the official markings of the telegraph office. Slack suspected forgery and said so loudly enough for the constable standing nearby to nod vigorously. Inquiries at the St. Mary Mead Post Office had yielded little. Mr. Leonard Copley swore that no such telegram had passed through his counter. He even grew indignant, pointing out that the telegram form itself was of an old design, one no longer in circulation. The inspector noted this with interest, though he privately thought Copley's defensiveness suspicious. After all, clerks were not above deceit if their pride or position was at stake. That afternoon, Slack summoned several villagers to the Colonel's drawing room for questioning. Mrs. Bantry arrived first, bustling in with her usual energy, but clearly relishing the drama of being an official witness. She described in painstaking detail the Colonel's collapse, her eyes widening with each retelling, though she could add little beyond what was already known. Miss Hartnell followed, brusque and indignant that her afternoon had been interrupted. I said from the first, Inspector, that the telegram was at the bottom of it. Poison may not be out of the question. Mark my words, there are substances that act with dreadful swiftness. She spoke with such certainty that one might have thought she was a pharmacist rather than a retired schoolmistress. Slack, though weary of speculation, wrote it down for form's sake. When Mrs. Price Ridley appeared, she was pale and fluttering, her lace cuffs trembling as she pressed them to her throat. I cannot think why the Colonel should be so afflicted in my garden, she said dramatically, though everyone present knew the gathering had been at Colonel Easterbrook's own house. Slack made a note of her confusion, but asked instead whether she had noticed the telegram before it fell. I did see the ribbon, she admitted reluctantly. It looked foreign in a way, something theatrical. Her daughter Edith sat beside her, thin hands folded tightly. She scarcely spoke, except to murmur that she had seen nothing at all. Yet Miss Marple, who had been permitted to sit quietly in the background at Mrs. Bantry's invitation, observed that the girl's eyes never strayed far from the desk where the telegram lay. Slack's patience was thin by the time Major Harper entered, striding with military bearing and offering little beyond indignation. Colonel Easterbrook was a fine soldier. This talk of poison or trickery is absurd. He fell, as many men do, to the heart. That is all. His tone suggested that any other conclusion would be an insult to the regiment. Despite the contradictions, Slack began shaping his theory. To him, the culprit was most likely Leonard Copley, the clerk. Who else had access to telegraph forms? Who else might have reason to insert a false message into the colonel's life? Copley was new to the village, untested, and therefore suspect by default. Slack resolved to keep a close watch on him. The villagers, meanwhile, had formed their own judgments. At the Blue Boar, the innkeeper declared that Edith Price Ridley's odd behavior made her the likeliest candidate. At the grocer's shop, customers whispered that Mrs. Bantry seemed unhealthily eager to discuss the colonel's demise. Each rumor gained strength by repetition, until even the vicar's wife was heard to say that no household could be considered entirely above suspicion. Miss Marple alone refrained from offering an opinion. She continued with her knitting in the evenings, needles flashing as she sat near the fire. But her mind was far from idle. She recalled with precision the faces of those who had gathered about the fallen colonel, the timbre of their voices, the slight betrayals of posture and glance. To her, these were the true clues. One evening, as she sat with Mrs. Bantry, she remarked in her mild, almost apologetic way, "It is interesting, isn't it, how differently people react to sudden death. Some are overcome with grief, others with shock, and still others with, how shall I put it, anxiety of another kind altogether." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "You mean Edith?" "I thought so myself." She looked positively stricken. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, dear Edith, but there are many kinds of distress. Not all of them arise from affection." The next morning brought another twist. Constable Polk, searching the colonel's writing desk more thoroughly, discovered a small scrap of paper tucked into a drawer. It appeared to be the corner of another telegram form, though much older, with a faint impression of handwriting that had long since faded. Slack examined it with interest, but dismissed it as a coincidence. Yet Miss Marple, who happened to be present on the pretext of bringing a basket of scones, noted the way the scrap had been folded, carefully, deliberately, as though meant to conceal something. She said nothing, only tucked the observation away in her mind, for she knew that scraps of paper, like human beings, often revealed more than they intended. As the village settled uneasily into its routines, the questions surrounding Colonel Easterbrook's death grew heavier. Why had he been chosen as the recipient of such a telegram? Who had sent it, and for what purpose? And why had he fallen so swiftly, as though struck not by illness alone, but by the weight of some unseen hand? Inspector Slack was determined to prove his case against the young clerk, but Miss Marple, seated once more by her window with her knitting, suspected the truth lay deeper. In the shifting expressions, the hurried whispers, and the things left unsaid, she sensed a web more intricate than the inspector imagined. And she knew, with the quiet certainty of long experience, that human nature would soon begin to betray itself piece by piece until the pattern was plain to anyone willing to see it. Inspector Slack wasted little time in narrowing his suspicions. To his mind, Leonard Copley, the clerk at the post office, had both the opportunity and the means to engineer a false telegram. He was young, relatively unknown in the village, and therefore the perfect sort to conceal questionable motives behind a polite manner. The inspector called him in for questioning at the police station, a low brick building with an air of severe authority, quite out of keeping with the quiet lanes of Saint. Mary Mead. Copley arrived neatly dressed, though his collar was askew, and his hands betrayed a faint tremor. I have told you before, Inspector. He began with some heat. No such message passed through my counter. Our records are clear. Every telegram is logged, and this velvet-tied thing was never among them. Slack leaned forward, his pencil poised. But you admit the form itself was of a design once used by the service? Years ago, Copley said quickly. Obsolete now, and I've never handled one myself. I couldn't have procured it. Slack gave a skeptical grunt. Forms go astray. A man with access might easily pocket one, thinking it would never be missed. The young clerk flushed. Do you accuse me of theft? Forgery? His voice cracked slightly, betraying both indignation and fear. I accuse no one yet, Slack replied with a grim smile. But you must see, Mr. Copley, that your position makes you convenient. By the time Copley was dismissed, he was visibly shaken. Word spread quickly that the inspector had pressed him hard, and by evening, whispers filled the village. At the Blue Boar, patrons shook their heads knowingly. Post office lad. It's always the quiet ones, muttered one. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley announced that she had always mistrusted him, though no one could recall her saying so before. Meanwhile, Edith Price Ridley remained curiously withdrawn. She went about her errands with lowered eyes, and more than one villager remarked on her pale, strained appearance. Some thought it was grief for the colonel, others whispered it was something else entirely. Miss Marple, for her part, did not voice any judgment. She continued her quiet routine, yet her mind sifted the details with a precision Inspector Slack might have envied. She recalled, for instance, the precise way Edith's gaze had lingered on the telegram in the colonel's study, as though it were an object of dread rather than curiosity. And she could not forget the faint impression of an older telegram form discovered in the desk, folded with deliberate care. One afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call upon Mrs. Bantry, who greeted her with an eagerness that was only partly disguised. My dear Jane, the whole village is in a state. Half of them say it was poison, the other half swear it was the telegram itself that killed him. And Slack he is so sure of the poor clerk. What do you think? Miss Marple set down her knitting bag and folded her hands. Well, dear, people are sometimes too eager to settle upon the simplest answer. It saves them the trouble of observing more closely. Yet I have often found that when everyone points in one direction, the truth is usually hiding in another. Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed. So you think Copley is innocent? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that human beings are very rarely what they seem on the surface. Mr. Copley may be proud and easily flustered, but those are not in themselves crimes. The following day brought fresh tension. Inspector Slack, determined to demonstrate progress, requested that Copley provide handwriting samples. They were compared to the elegant cursive on the telegram, but the match was far from convincing. The loops and flourishes were too ornate, too feminine almost for Copley's tidy, clerkly script. Dr. Haydock, consulted once again, suggested that the colonel might indeed have suffered heart failure precipitated by shock, but he added with emphasis, one cannot ignore the timing. Whatever was written in that message had an effect beyond ordinary bad news. Slack seized on this with relish, declaring in the snug of the inn that Copley had most likely contrived the telegram with the intent to frighten the colonel, perhaps into some rash disclosure. The fellow's nervous manner gives him away, Slack insisted, thumping the table. Mark my words, he knows more than he lets on. Yet Miss Marple, sipping tea in her own parlor, considered matters differently. Nervousness, she knew, could spring from guilt, but it could also arise from innocence under suspicion. And it was often the small, overlooked details, the choice of a ribbon, the fold of a paper, the way a young girl avoided her mother's gaze that betrayed the truth far more than official interrogations. Later that week, Miss Marple found herself in the company of Edith Price Ridley. They met in the lane by chance, Edith carrying a basket of books for the vicar's wife. The girl looked weary, her eyes shadowed. "You're very thoughtful to run errands, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "though one might think you have had enough to burden you of late." Edith hesitated, then forced a small smile. "People will talk, Miss Marple. They always do. It is best not to give them more reason." "Quite right," Miss Marple murmured. "Though I have always found that people talk more when they are uncertain. Once the truth is clear, there is rather less to say." The girl gave her a startled look, then hurried on, leaving Miss Marple with the distinct impression that her words had touched a nerve. That evening, as dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, the village seemed tense, as though waiting for something to break. Inspector Slack, puffed up with confidence, was convinced he had identified his man. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting, reflected that the case was only just beginning to unfold. For if the inspector was so eager to settle blame upon the obvious suspect, it left others free to move unnoticed in the shadows. And she, who had spent a lifetime observing the quiet treacheries of human behavior, suspected those shadows were where the real danger lay. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into its curious rhythm of normalcy, overlaid with gossip. Daily errands were carried out, the grocer's bell rang as usual, and the post office counter bustled with letters and parcels. Yet underneath these routines, the memory of Colonel Easterbrook's sudden death lingered like a shadow in the summer sun. Every conversation, no matter how trivial it began, seemed to circle back to the telegram with its strange ribbon. Inspector Slack, despite the lack of tangible evidence, continued to press his suspicions upon Leonard Copley. He was convinced that the young clerk's nervousness, evasive answers, and proximity to telegraphic forms marked him as the culprit. Each day, the inspector appeared more confident, as if determination alone might settle the matter. But Miss Marple was not satisfied. She had long since learned that human behavior often betrayed what evidence could not. And there was one small matter that she could not put from her mind: the velvet ribbon. It was not the sort of thing one found lying about in the ordinary way. Telegrams were practical, official, and often brusque. They were not bound in finery. Velvet ribbons belonged to writing desks, to ladies' sewing baskets, or perhaps to gifts carefully wrapped. They did not belong to a message delivered in haste, warning of life and death. One afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call upon the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, who prided herself on her well-ordered household. Over tea, Miss Marple let the conversation drift toward the subject of ribbons. "I always admire how you keep your sewing things so tidy," Miss Marple said in her gentle way. "I dare say you could find any piece of trim or thread at a moment's notice." Mrs. Clement smiled modestly. "Oh, I do try. But velvet ribbons? No, I've none of those. They're expensive and not easily come by." "Why do you ask, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple shook her head as though embarrassed. "Only a small curiosity. One hears so many details repeated, you know. Sometimes it is hard to know which matters." The vicar's wife leaned forward, lowering her voice instinctively. "If you ask me, it was theatrical. Someone wished to make a show of it. And I cannot help but notice that Mrs. Price Ridley's daughter has taken to wearing her hair tied with a velvet bow of late. Blue it was, when I saw her on Sunday. Very smart, though perhaps not quite in keeping with her mother's sense of economy." Miss Marple made a little sound of agreement, though her mind was occupied. She recalled Edith Price Ridley's nervous glances, her pallor, her reluctance to speak. Could it be that the ribbon had been hers? That evening, Miss Marple examined her own sewing drawer, where neat bundles of thread and ribbon lay in rows. She touched each kind in turn, as though to remind herself of their uses. Velvet, she reflected, was not merely decorative. It spoke of a hand that wished to disguise the ordinary with something luxurious, to make a thing appear more important than it truly was. Meanwhile, Inspector Slack gathered the villagers, once more for questioning. This time, he fixed his attention on Edith herself. "You were present when the colonel collapsed," he said sternly. "You saw the telegram in his hand. Did you notice anything unusual about it before it fell?" Edith swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward her mother. "No," she said quickly. "I saw nothing." Slack pressed further, and yet the telegram bore a ribbon. A young lady might know more about such things than most. Do you deny ever having such a ribbon in your possession? The girl's face flushed crimson. I have ribbons. Yes, but not that one. Her denial came too quickly, and the inspector scribbled it down as if it were a confession. Mrs. Price Ridley, seated beside her, bristled with indignation. Inspector, my daughter has no part in this dreadful affair. To suggest otherwise is shameful. You have already accused Mr. Copley. Must you drag a young girl's name into the matter as well? Slack gave a curt nod, but his eyes gleamed. To him, Edith's hesitation was damning. He was certain the case was tightening. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window, said nothing. She merely observed the play of emotions, the girl's panic, the mother's outrage, the inspector's triumph. It was a tableau she had seen before in other circumstances, when small lies disguised larger truths. Later that night, Miss Marple took a solitary walk through the village lanes. The air was soft with the scent of honeysuckle, and the lamps in cottage windows glowed warmly. Yet her mind was fixed on the ribbon. She considered the sorts of people who might use such a thing. Not Copley's life was too plain, too orderly for such embellishment. Not the colonel. His habits were brisk, almost austere. But a young woman, perhaps, or someone wishing to cloak a message in false sentimentality. The following day brought confirmation of her instinct. Mrs. Bantry, arriving for her usual chat, confided in a whisper that she had seen Edith Price Ridley at the haberdasher's only a week earlier, purchasing a velvet ribbon. The girl was most particular about it, Mrs. Bantry said. Asked for a length quite sufficient to tie a bow. I thought it rather extravagant. Miss Marple listened carefully, nodding. The clue was slight, but it fit. Edith had access to velvet ribbon, and the telegram had been bound with such a piece. But why? That was the question. As the village buzzed with renewed speculation, Miss Marple sat by her parlor window, knitting needles flashing steadily. Her eyes were distant, thoughtful. She knew that in every puzzle there was always one small detail stitch, a fold, a ribbon that seemed inconsequential until one looked at it from the proper angle. And she was beginning to suspect that the velvet ribbon was not merely an adornment, but the very thread that would unravel the mystery of Colonel Easterbrook's death. The suspicion that had begun with Leonard Copley and shifted uneasily toward Edith Price Ridley soon spread to encompass half the village. It was as though Colonel Easterbrook's death had loosened the threads of civility, allowing the undercurrents of resentment and envy to seep into view. Where once neighbors had greeted each other with cheerful nods, now there were measured pauses, suspicious glances, and whispers left unfinished when someone entered a room. Inspector Slack relished this tension. To him, it was proof that his questioning unsettled the guilty. He prowled the lanes of Saint Mary Mead with a self-important air, summoning villagers to repeat their statements and marking down their contradictions. Yet for all his energy, the facts did not settle neatly. Motives emerged, yes, but they overlapped, and none pointed directly to the hand that had tied the velvet ribbon. One afternoon at the Blue Boar Inn, the simmering tension came to a head. Major Harper, flushed from an extra glass of ale, accused Copley outright of forging the telegram. "You had the forms, man, and the chance," Harper barked, slamming his fist upon the wooden table. "You frightened the colonel into his grave, and don't deny it." Copley stood, pale but resolute. "I deny it with every breath, Major. I respected Colonel Easterbrook, and I would never do such a thing. Your bluster does not make it true." The inn grew hushed, all ears straining. Mrs. Price Ridley, seated in the corner, sniffed loudly and declared that her daughter's name had been dragged unjustly through the mud because of idle insinuations and male vanity. Edith sat beside her, eyes lowered, hands twisting the hem of her dress. It was then that Miss Hartnell, unable to resist, interjected with her usual sharpness. "If you ask me, Edith's behavior speaks for itself. No young woman blushes and stammers so, unless she has something to conceal." Edith rose suddenly, her face crimson. "How dare you? You know nothing at all." Her voice trembled with more than anger, and she fled the inn, leaving behind a stunned silence. Miss Marple, who had been present at a nearby table with Mrs. Bantry, watched the scene unfold with quiet eyes. To her, Edith's outburst revealed more than any calm denial could have done. Not guilt, perhaps, but fear, and fear often came from knowledge too dangerous to speak aloud. Later that evening, Miss Marple shared her impressions with Mrs. Bantry as they walked back through the dusk-lit lane. "It is remarkable," she said softly, "how people reveal themselves under pressure. One might almost think of it as embroidery, where the hidden stitches on the back are quite different from the neat pattern displayed on the front." Mrs. Bantry nodded eagerly. "You mean Edith knows more than she lets on?" "I thought so myself." "But what, Jane? What could a timid girl like that possibly be hiding?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One should never assume timidity means ignorance, my dear. Sometimes the quietest of us notice more than others would ever imagine." The next day brought a new ripple of scandal. Word spread that the colonel, for all his upright military bearing, had not been entirely free of entanglements. A rumor surfaced that he had quarreled bitterly with a gentleman in the neighboring parish over money. Another suggested that a certain widow in the village had once been overly fond of his company. Each whisper contradicted the next, but together they painted a picture far less spotless than the one most had assumed. Inspector Slack pounced on these stories with relish, though he used them chiefly to bolster his case against Copley. The colonel had secrets, he declared. Secrets worth keeping, and our clerk knew of them. He saw a chance to profit by sending that false telegram to shake the man's nerves. Miss Marple, however, thought differently. She sat one afternoon with Dr. Haydock, who confessed in a rare moment of candor that he had treated the colonel for stress some months prior. He was worried, the doctor admitted. Said something about letters, though he wouldn't elaborate. I thought it best not to pry. Men of his sort don't take kindly to probing questions. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind working rapidly. Letters, telegrams, ribbons were not merely props in a melodrama, but threads of a pattern, and the colonel's death was at its center. Meanwhile, Edith Price Ridley grew more withdrawn. Miss Marple, always tactful, contrived to meet her in the lane once more. "My dear," she said gently, "I wonder if you would permit an old woman to trouble you for a moment. You see, I've been thinking about ribbons." Edith gave a startled glance. "Ribbons?" "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "Velvet ones in particular. They are not common. One notices such things, and one notices too when people become distressed over them." The girl's lips trembled, but she pressed them firmly together. "Please, Miss Marple, I cannot speak of it." Miss Marple laid a hand lightly on her arm. "You need not, if it causes you pain. Only remember, silence is sometimes more dangerous than words. The truth has a way of coming out, however carefully one tries to hide it." Edith looked at her then with wide, frightened eyes, as though she had glimpsed an understanding too sharp to deny. But she said nothing more and hurried away. By the week's end, the village was a cauldron of suspicion. Slack believed he was closing in on Copley, though his evidence remained thin. Edith's behavior kept her firmly in the circle of gossip, and even Mrs. Bantry could not resist speculating on her possible involvement. Major Harper grew more vocal in defending the colonel's honor, which only invited whispers that he had reasons of his own to protect the man's memory. Through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting, listening, observing, and piecing together the human motives beneath the surface. For she had seen enough to know that the colonel's death was not the simple matter. Slack, imagined. Behind the quarrels, the evasions, and the sudden bursts of temper lay secrets long buried. And soon, she felt, those secrets would begin to surface, like stones rising through soil after the frost, sharp and undeniable. For a week after Colonel Easterbrook's funeral, the village tried to return to its ordinary rhythm, though it was a poor imitation. The colonel's absence was felt in subtle ways: the lack of his brisk salute to passing neighbors, the empty seat at the parish council, and the silence of his once bustling garden where roses now bloomed unchecked. Yet the memory of his sudden death remained, gnawing at conversations like a persistent wasp. Inspector Slack continued to pursue Leonard Copley with unshaken confidence, though his evidence had not improved. Edith Price Ridley remained pale and withdrawn, her mother loud in defense but secretly worried, as Miss Marple had noticed. It seemed the matter might eventually fade into a stalemate of rumor and suspicion, until one damp morning brought a fresh disturbance. The postmistress herself, Mrs. Groves, from the neighboring parish of Much Haddam, arrived in St. Mary Mead with startling news. She carried under her arm a bundle of telegram slips, neatly bound, which she delivered with grave importance to Inspector Slack. "I thought it strange," she said, "that one of our forms had gone missing. We keep them locked away, you see. But 2 weeks ago, one was not where it ought to be. I said nothing at the time, for mistakes do happen, but when I heard of Colonel Easterbrook's death, I began to wonder." The inspector's eyes lit up. Here was fuel for his case. Yet when he spread the slips on the colonel's desk, one detail stood out. The missing form was not blank. It bore faint marks where someone had tested a pen. Not official telegraph writing at all, but loops and flourishes like those of someone practicing a signature. It was Mrs. Bantry, peering over his shoulder with her usual curiosity, who exclaimed, "Why, it looks like a lady's hand." "Nothing like poor Mr. Copley's tidy figures." Slack scowled but could not deny the truth. He muttered something about accomplices, though his certainty wavered. The discovery spread quickly. By afternoon, the village was alive again with speculation. At the grocer's counter, Miss Hartnell declared that the evidence proved a woman had been involved all along. At the inn, patrons whispered that Edith Price Ridley had been seen practicing handwriting more than once, as if preparing for something secret. It was in the midst of this renewed fervor that another incident occurred. A fire broke out in one of the colonel's outbuildings' small storage shed at the far edge of the garden. The flames were quickly contained, but not before villagers gathered to watch the smoke curl into the sky. When the blaze was extinguished, Inspector Slack discovered a pile of charred papers, too damaged to read, but clearly once correspondence. "A clumsy attempt to destroy evidence," Slack pronounced with satisfaction. "The guilty party grows desperate." Miss Marple, standing with Mrs. Bantry near the garden gate, said nothing. Her eyes lingered on the ashes, noting the careful way the fire had been started in one corner and fed with paper only, leaving tools and wood untouched. It was not a careless blaze, but a deliberate one, designed to consume letters and nothing else. That evening, Miss Marple reflected quietly in her sitting room. She thought of Dr. Haydock's remark about the colonel's worries over letters, of the missing telegram form from Much Haddam, and of the velvet ribbon. Taken separately, each detail could be dismissed as curiosity. Together, they suggested intention, planning, and concealment. The next day brought further murmurs. Edith Price Ridley was seen at the churchyard, lingering near the colonel's grave with an expression of deep agitation. Some said she wept, others insisted she was speaking under her breath, as though to the colonel himself. Mrs. Price Ridley, mortified by the gossip, declared that her daughter was sensitive and that the village ought to mind its own affairs. Inspector Slack, however, seized upon the story with vigor. He summoned Edith again, demanding to know what connection she had with the colonel's correspondence. The girl trembled visibly, unable to answer. Her silence was damning in the inspector's eyes, yet Miss Marple, who heard the account later from Mrs. Bantry, considered it differently. She knew that silence often covered fear, but not always guilt. Sometimes it concealed loyalty, or even shame, not one's own. It was that evening, as she sat with her knitting, that Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest smile, for she remembered a curious tale from years past about a neighbor who had once forged a letter to spare her family embarrassment. The handwriting had been discovered not because it was clumsy, but because it was too careful, too practiced, much like the loops and flourishes on the missing telegram form. She looked down at her needles, the steady click echoing in the quiet parlor. The case was beginning to take on its true shape, though others had not yet seen it. The Colonel's death was not merely the end of a man, but the unmasking of secrets that several households would rather have kept buried. The fire in the outbuilding had proved that. Someone was willing to risk discovery rather than let the truth emerge in the form of letters. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes half closed. She was in no hurry. Human nature, she knew, would do most of the work for her. People betrayed themselves sooner or later, and in St. Mary Mead, where gossip was as natural as breathing, the truth would not remain hidden for long. But until then, she would sit, listen, and wait. For another revelation was bound to come, as surely as roses bloomed in June and as surely as velvet ribbons did not belong on telegrams. The fire in Colonel Easterbrook's outbuilding had left the village in a state of restless anticipation. It was no longer only the telegram that occupied whispered conversations, but also the mystery of the destroyed papers. Everyone wondered what those letters had contained and who had been so determined to see them reduced to ash. Inspector Slack, emboldened by the incident, declared at the Blue Boar that he had the guilty party within his grasp. The destruction of evidence is a desperate act, he pronounced, puffing out his chest, and desperate acts are the hallmark of those cornered by the law. His audience murmured in agreement, though few could decide whether he meant Leonard Copley or Edith Price Ridley. Both names surfaced again and again, as though repeating them might make one true. Miss Marple, listening quietly in Mrs. Bantry's drawing room the next day, had a different view. One must remember, she said mildly, that not all desperate acts are committed by the guilty. Sometimes they are done by the fearful, or even by the well-intentioned who wish to shield another. Human motives are rarely so tidy as Inspector Slack would prefer. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "And you think Edith is shielding someone? Or perhaps Leonard?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "I think, my dear, that when one wishes to know the truth, it is best to watch what people do when they believe themselves unobserved. Words can deceive. Actions are less so." That afternoon, Miss Marple put her belief into quiet practice. She began her little visits, those seemingly harmless calls for tea or brief walks in the lane. To each person of interest, she posed an innocuous remark, one that might seem casual but was chosen with great care. Her first call was upon Leonard Copley, whom she found in the post office arranging a stack of envelopes. "Such a busy place, the post," she said pleasantly. "I sometimes wonder how you keep track of it all. Why, only the other day someone remarked that forms go astray so easily. Imagine if one were to find a slip used for, practicing handwriting, perhaps. One could almost mistake it for mischief." Copley looked up sharply, his expression clouded with both irritation and relief. "I should hope no one believes I waste government property on such foolishness. My business is order, Miss Marple. If someone practiced flourishes on a form, it was not me." His answer came too quickly, too defensively, but his face lacked the fear of guilt. It was pride, wounded and raw. Later, Miss Marple stopped at the Price Ridley home under the pretext of delivering some lavender sachets. Edith answered the door, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes heavy with fatigue. "How kind you are, Miss Marple," she whispered, leading her to the parlor. Mrs. Price Ridley was out visiting a neighbor, and the girl seemed both relieved and uneasy at being alone with her guest. As they sat together, Miss Marple remarked gently, "I saw the Colonel's garden the other day. Such fine roses. It made me wonder whether the fire that destroyed his papers might have been started with petals or ribbons. Something small and delicate. So curious, don't you think?" Edith's face blanched, and she twisted her handkerchief until it nearly tore. "I cannot speak of it," she murmured, her voice breaking. "Please do not ask me." Miss Marple did not press. She only patted the girl's hand with grandmotherly kindness. "Of course, my dear, you must do only what you feel able to. But remember, concealment is often heavier to bear than confession." That evening, Edith was seen walking alone near the vicarage, her face pale, her steps uncertain. Several villagers remarked on her strange demeanor, and Miss Hartnell proclaimed that it was the unmistakable sign of guilt. Miss Marple, however, considered it the mark of a soul under unbearable strain. The following day, Miss Marple extended her net a little further. She happened upon Major Harper near the churchyard, where he stood gazing at Colonel Easterbrook's grave. His back was stiff, his hat clasped in one hand, as though he were standing on parade. "You must miss him greatly," Miss Marple said softly. Harper started, then cleared his throat. The colonel was a fine soldier. His death was unfortunate. Miss Marple tilted her head, so sudden and with such curious circumstances. That telegram, for instance, is so dramatic. One might almost think it meant to evoke the battlefield, a call to arms. Harper's jaw tightened. "I prefer not to dwell on it. Idle speculations dishonor the man's memory." But Miss Marple noticed how his hand gripped the brim of his hat until his knuckles whitened, and how his eyes avoided hers with unnatural determination. A soldier's discipline, perhaps, but also the stiffness of one who feared discovery. By evening, Miss Marple had drawn her quiet conclusions. Each had revealed something in their reactions. Copley, his pride; Edith, her fear; Harper, his restraint. None had confessed, but none had been able to disguise themselves fully either. And in those subtle betrayals of human nature lay the beginnings of truth. She shared her thoughts, in her usual understated way, with Mrs. Bantry over a pot of tea. "It is most instructive," she said, "to see how people respond to small nudges. One does not need to accuse directly. A gentle remark, a suggestion, or even an innocent question can bring forth more than a dozen interrogations. It is all rather like stirring a spoon in a cup of tea. The leaves will swirl, and in the end, the pattern will become clear." Mrs. Bantry shivered in delight. "Jane, you do make it sound almost like conjuring." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not conjuring, my dear. Only observation. People tell you who they are, if only you know how to listen." The village, meanwhile, braced for the inspector's next move. Slack grew, impatient with the lack of tangible progress, and whispers of another arrest circulated. But Miss Marple, with her knitting in hand, felt certain that the real test had only just begun. She had seen enough to know which threads to follow, and she was prepared to tug them lightly, gently, until the fabric of deception began to unravel of its own accord. The air in St. Mary Mead had grown heavy with speculation. Though the church bells rang as always, and the children played in the lanes, an unease hung over the village like a low mist. The colonel's sudden death, the strange telegram, and now the fire in his garden had combined into something larger than gossip. It had become a weight pressing upon every household. Inspector Slack, restless and irritable, had begun to lose patience. He could not abide the meandering pace of village life, where suspicions seemed to multiply faster than he could chase them down. His conviction about Leonard Copley had weakened, yet he could not bear to admit it openly. Instead, he barked questions at townsfolk and muttered darkly about accomplices. Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued her patient work. She sat in drawing rooms and parlors, listening more than speaking, allowing others to reveal themselves. It was during these quiet hours that the shadows of truth began to gather. She noticed, for example, that Mrs. Price Ridley grew sharp whenever the subject of correspondence was raised. The lady who normally loved to share tidbits of village life now snapped shut like a book whenever letters or telegrams were mentioned. Edith, too, became more fragile. She avoided the company of her peers, and her once neat appearance grew slightly disheveled. Several villagers remarked that she looked on the verge of collapse. To Miss Marple, the girl seemed caught between fear and duty, as if she bore knowledge too burdensome to speak aloud. One evening at the Blue Boar, conversation turned once again to the Colonel's papers. A labourer who had helped extinguish the fire swore he had seen fragments of a letter that bore a woman's hand. He could not read the words, but the loops and flourishes had been clear. At this, Miss Hartnell declared triumphantly that the evidence pointed unmistakably to a female culprit. Mrs. Bantry countered with the suggestion that perhaps the Colonel had received letters of a compromising nature, letters someone wished to erase from sight forever. The inn hummed with theories, each more dramatic than the last. Yet Miss Marple, seated in her corner with her teacup, noticed something more subtle. Major Harper, who had always been so vigorous in defending the Colonel's reputation, sat silent that evening, his eyes fixed on the fire. When Mrs. Bantry spoke of letters, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was a small reaction, but enough to tell Miss Marple that the Major, too, carried a secret. The following morning, Miss Marple contrived to meet him near the churchyard. She greeted him with her usual warmth, speaking first of roses and weather before turning to the subject she had intended. "It must be a burden," she said gently, "to see a friend's good name bandied about in such a careless way." Harper looked at her sharply. "It is disgraceful. The Colonel was a man of honor." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed. But honor can be a complicated thing, don't you think? Sometimes men do rash things to preserve it. Sometimes others do rash things to protect them." For a moment, Harper looked as though he would reply, but then he turned on his heel and marched away, leaving her with the certainty that her words had struck close to the truth. Meanwhile, Inspector Slack had his own revelation. A constable reported that a witness from Much Haddam claimed to have seen Edith Price Ridley purchasing writing paper and ink only days before the Colonel's death. To Slack, this was proof that Edith had composed the false telegram. He strode about the village with renewed energy, declaring that an arrest was imminent. But Miss Marple shook her head when Mrs. Bantry repeated the news to her. "My dear," she said softly, "a young woman buying paper and ink is hardly remarkable. Indeed, it is rather what one might expect. The question is not whether she wrote, but what she was compelled to write and for whom." That night, the village buzzed with a fresh rumor. Someone had broken into the Colonel's study. Nothing appeared stolen, yet the desk drawers were disturbed and papers scattered. It was as though someone had searched for something very specific. The villagers whispered that it must be Edith again, creeping in under the cover of darkness. Others suggested Leonard Copley, desperate to conceal his forgeries. Miss Marple, however, thought otherwise. The disturbance was too thorough, too methodical for a frightened girl or a flustered clerk. It was the work of someone accustomed to discipline, someone who could act swiftly and leave little trace. Her thoughts returned, not for the first time, to Major Harper and his clenched jaw at the inn. The shadows deepened in the days that followed. Edith seemed ever more fragile, Leonard grew embittered, and Harper avoided conversation. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, usually eager for attention, withdrew into her house. The village no longer felt like a place of gentle tease and garden chatter, but rather a stage where each player carried a hidden script. Miss Marple, watching it all with calm eyes, knew that the time was approaching when silence would no longer suffice. The truth pressed closer, and with it the danger of exposure. She had seen such patterns before, and they rarely ended without a final, decisive act. As she folded her knitting one evening and set it aside, she reflected on the nature of secrets. They could be hidden for years, buried under propriety and smiles, but once disturbed, they rose like smoke from a fire. Colonel Easterbrook's death had disturbed many such secrets, and the smoke now curled visibly above the village. The question, Miss Marple thought, was not whether the truth would emerge, but who would be undone by it first. By the second week after Colonel Easterbrook's funeral, St. Mary Mead had become a divided village. Neighbors still greeted each other at the greengrocer's and exchanged pleasantries at the post office, but beneath the surface there was wariness. Suspicion lay in every glance, and even long-standing friendships strained under the weight of unspoken doubts. Inspector Slack had grown restless. His authority, so decisive at the start, now felt fragile in the face of conflicting rumors. He had already declared Leonard Copley guilty twice over in the snug of the Blue Boar. Yet circumstances had refused to align neatly with his conclusions. The burned papers, the missing telegram form, the reports of Edith Price Ridley's purchases, each piece seemed to point in different directions. Slack did what men of his temperament often did under strain. He pressed harder. The morning after the break-in at the Colonel's study, he marched to the Price Ridley home with a constable in tow. The villagers, ever quick to sense drama, lingered at their garden gates to watch. Inside, Slack confronted Edith with a stern expression and booming voice. "You were seen near the Colonel's study on the night of the disturbance. What were you doing there?" Edith, pale and trembling, shook her head. "I was not there. I swear it." Her mother rose to her defense at once, cheeks flushed with indignation. "How dare you, Inspector, to accuse a respectable young woman of creeping about in the dark? Edith was with me all evening. She never left the house." Slack eyed them both with skepticism. "You may protect her if you wish, madam, but the truth will out, and when it does, I shall have no hesitation in making an arrest." Edith's eyes filled with tears, and she fled the room. Mrs. Price Ridley turned on the inspector with fury, but Slack only made a curt bow and departed, his constable trailing behind. That evening, the story was on every lip. Some said Edith had confessed in private, others that the inspector meant to charge her within days. Miss Hartnell declared that the girl's behavior was proof of her guilt, while Mrs. Bantry, though fond of gossip, defended her. She is a fragile, poor child. Fear makes her falter, not guilt. Miss Marple said little. She sat with her knitting in her neat parlor, letting the click of her needles fill the silence. Yet her mind was not quiet. She recalled Edith's reaction to the mention of the ribbon, her tremor when questioned about the telegram, her agitation at the churchyard. None of these suggested the cold calculation of a forger. They spoke instead of someone caught in another's web. The following day, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Colonel's house. Under the pretext of delivering flowers, she was shown into the study, where Inspector Slack was already rifling through the desk. He looked up with irritation at her entrance. "Another errand of mercy, Miss Marple?" he asked dryly. "Merely a neighborly kindness," she said, setting the flowers on the windowsill. Her eyes wandered about the room, alighting on the empty drawers and scattered papers. "It must be difficult, Inspector, when people say so much and yet so little of value. Human beings are the most unreliable witnesses." Slack grunted. "Unreliable, yes, but guilty all the same. Mark my words, the girl will slip, and then we shall have her." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "You may be right, and yet sometimes the hand that seems weakest is merely shielding another. One must always consider who benefits most from silence." Slack dismissed her words with a wave, but she had not spoken idly. As she walked home through the lanes, she thought of Major Harper's clenched jaw, of Mrs. Price Ridley's abrupt silences, of Copley's wounded pride. All were entangled, each concealing something, though not all concealed the same thing. That evening, Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Bantry, who leaned close with excitement. "Jane, I have it on good authority that the Colonel kept a locked box in his study. No one has found the key. What do you make of that?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Locked boxes, my dear, often tell us less about what they contain than about the fear of discovery. A man may lock away love letters, debts, or trifles of vanity, but what matters is why he fears their exposure." Mrs. Bantry gave a delighted shiver. "Do you suppose the fire was meant to destroy what was inside?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. "Or perhaps it was meant to make us believe something had been destroyed, when in fact the true secret lies elsewhere." The next day, the mystery deepened further. A boy delivering milk to the Colonel's empty house noticed something unusual by the hedge. A scrap of ribbon, singed at one end as if caught by flame. He showed it to his mother, who brought it straight to Mrs. Bantry, who in turn hurried to Miss Marple with her find. Miss Marple examined it with calm interest. It was indeed velvet, dark and soft, the cut edges ragged. She turned it over in her hands, considering, if it had survived the fire, then perhaps it had been dropped in haste. Or perhaps someone had wished it to be found, a fragment placed to lead suspicion once more toward Edith. That evening, as the sun set over the village, Miss Marple sat by her window and reflected. The net was tightening, yes, but not in the way Inspector Slack imagined. He saw only Edith caught within it. Miss Marple saw the threads stretching wider, entangling others who had remained too silent, too stiff, too defensive. She knew the moment was approaching when the pattern would emerge fully. The velvet ribbon, the forged telegram, the destroyed papers, and the locked box all were pieces of the same design. And, when the final thread was pulled, the whole would unravel, leaving the truth plain for all to see. The tension insane. Mary Mead had reached a point where it could no longer be contained in whispers at the inn or glances exchanged over garden fences. Inspector Slack, frustrated by the evasions and contradictions of the villagers, decided that a decisive meeting was needed. He summoned the principal figures, Leonard Copley, Major Harper, Mrs. Price Ridley, and her daughter Edith, to gather in Colonel Easterbrook's study. The summons alone was enough to set the village buzzing. By mid-afternoon, half the parish knew that something momentous was afoot, though no one knew precisely what. Mrs. Bantry, of course, contrived to be present, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was invited as well. Slack made no secret of his belief that the old lady enjoyed meddling, but he had also learned, in spite of himself, that she often saw what others overlooked. The gathering took place on a damp evening, the windows of the study misted with condensation. The colonel's desk loomed in the corner, its drawers still half open from the inspector's earlier searches. A fire smouldered in the grate, but the warmth did little to dispel the unease that hung in the room. Inspector Slack opened the proceedings with a sharp rap of his hand on the desk. "We are here," he announced, "because the time has come to settle this business. Colonel Easterbrook did not fall by chance. He was driven to his death by deceit, and I intend to expose the one responsible." His gaze swung toward Leonard Copley, who sat stiffly, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles whitened. "You, sir, had access to telegram forms. You knew how to contrive a message that would strike fear. And you had reason new to the village, anxious to assert yourself, perhaps even resentful of the colonel's authority." Copley flushed. "I have said again and again, Inspector, I had nothing to do with it. Yes, I am new here, but that is hardly a crime. I respected Colonel Easterbrook. Why should I wish him harm?" Slack ignored the question. "Your nervous manner betrays you. You were seen loitering near the colonel's house on more than one occasion." "I delivered letters," Copley retorted hotly. "That was my duty." The inspector was about to press further when Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the tension. "If I may, Inspector, I wonder whether we might allow each person to speak in turn. Sometimes, you know, people reveal more than they intend when they are given a chance to tell their story in their own words." Slack frowned, but relented with a wave of his hand. "Very well, Miss Marple. But let us not lose sight of the facts." Miss Marple turned her mild gaze upon Mrs. Price Ridley, who sat upright, her lace cuffs trembling with indignation. "It must have been most distressing for you, my dear, to see suspicion fall upon your daughter." "Distressing?" Mrs. Price Ridley exclaimed. "It has been intolerable. Edith is blameless, entirely blameless. To suggest otherwise is malicious. She is a delicate girl, unused to such scrutiny." Yet even as she spoke, Edith shifted uneasily in her chair, her eyes downcast. Miss Marple noted how her fingers twisted in her lap, the same nervous gesture she had observed before. "Young people often find themselves caught in difficulties not of their own making," Miss Marple said softly. "It is not always their fault. Sometimes they act under pressure, even out of loyalty." At this, Edith's head jerked upward, her eyes wide with alarm. Her lips parted as though she meant to speak, but she glanced quickly at her mother and fell silent again. Major Harper, who had been standing near the fireplace, cleared his throat. "All this is needless," he said brusquely. The colonel was a soldier. His heart failed him, nothing more. These endless theories dishonor his memory. Slack turned on him. "And yet, Major, you were seen near the colonel's house the night of the fire. Can you explain that?" Harper stiffened. "I walk often in the evenings. A habit of long standing. There is nothing unusual in it." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him. His tone was steady, but she noticed how he avoided looking at the desk where the remnants of burned papers had been placed in a tray. His avoidance was deliberate, and it told her much. Mrs. Bantry, unable to restrain herself, burst out, "But the letters. Everyone says the colonel had letters he wished hidden. Perhaps that was why someone set the fire." The room fell silent at her words, for all knew the truth of them. The colonel had been a man of secrets, and secrets rarely rested quietly. Inspector Slack straightened, his face flushed with determination. Enough prevarication. The evidence points to forgery, to destruction of papers, to deceit. I will have the truth, and I will have it now. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her expression one of mild thoughtfulness. The truth, Inspector, does have a way of emerging. But it often comes gently, like dawn breaking. It requires patience and a willingness to see not only what people say, but why they say it, or do not say it. Her words hung in the air, quiet but steady. She knew the moment was close, when each person's silence, denial, or outburst would weave together into a pattern no longer hidden. The gathering was not yet at its climax, but the threads were tightening. For in that room, beneath the misted windows and smoldering fire, the guilty hand sat among the innocent, and Miss Marple, watching with her sharp yet gentle eyes, was ready to tug the final thread that would unravel the whole. The fire in the colonel's study glowed low, sending flickers of light across the tense faces gathered there. Inspector Slack tapped his pencil on the desk impatiently, convinced that a bold accusation would soon crack open the case. Yet the silence in the room seemed to thrum, with a different energy, one that belonged less to the inspector's bluster and more to the quiet presence of Miss Marple. She sat a little apart from the others, her hands folded serenely on her lap, her eyes moving from face to face. She had watched the outbursts, the silences, the deflections. Now she was watching something else, the weariness that comes when lies grow too heavy to bear. Inspector Slack broke the stillness first. "We are going in circles," he barked. "The girl knows more than she admits. The clerk has lied about his access, and Major Harper skulks around the colonel's grounds at night. I could arrest any one of you and see what the courts make of it." Mrs. Price Ridley gasped, her hand fluttering to her throat. "Arrest my daughter? I shall not allow it. Edith is innocent. She has done nothing wrong." Her voice rang sharp in the room, but it was Edith herself who trembled most visibly. She leaned forward, her voice barely audible. "Mother, please." But before she could say more, Major Harper stepped closer to the fire, his face in shadow. "This is all a farce," he said with forced calm. "The colonel's death was natural, whatever strange trappings surrounded it. To claim otherwise demeans his service." Miss Marple's voice, gentle but steady, rose into the silence that followed. "I've often observed," she began, "that people reveal themselves most clearly when they are forced into proximity with others. Each of you has carried a burden these past weeks, and burdens have a way of leaving marks. A trembling hand here, a silence where there should be words, a sudden flare of anger. These things speak more loudly than evidence." Inspector Slack muttered, "Evidence is what convicts, Miss Marple, not embroidery of character." But she went on as though she had not heard. The telegram, for instance. Such a curious object. Urgent words, yet bound with velvet ribbon. It was not a message meant merely to inform, was meant to impress, even to mislead. One must ask oneself who in this room would think to disguise the ordinary with the appearance of importance. Her eyes rested briefly on Edith, who flushed scarlet, then on Mrs. Price Ridley, who stiffened, and finally on Major Harper, whose lips pressed together in a thin line. And then, she continued softly, the fire. Not a careless blaze, but a deliberate one, set only to consume papers. Someone was very determined to prevent those letters from being read. And yet, as I remarked to a friend, fire does not always destroy so completely as one hopes. The mere act of burning calls attention where silence might have sufficed. A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Bantry, perched eagerly on her chair, leaned forward as though anticipating a stage play's climax. Edith's hands twisted the hem of her dress until the fabric puckered. Miss Marple's gaze fell at last on Leonard Copley. "And you, my dear young man, have suffered unfair suspicion. Your pride has made you defensive, and pride can look very much like guilt. But I believe you are guilty only of inexperience and of caring too much for the opinion of others." Copley's eyes widened, and for the first time in weeks, he looked almost relieved. Slack bristled. "You make it sound as though none of them is guilty, and yet one of them forged that telegram." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, and one of them feared those letters enough to see them burned, and one of them has borne the weight of concealment until it shows in every glance and gesture. The silence that followed was taut." Mrs. Price Ridley shifted uncomfortably. Major Harper's hand clenched tighter on his hat, and Edith let out a faint sob. Miss Marple folded her hands more neatly, her eyes kind yet unwavering. "The truth is near, Inspector. It is already here in this room, but it requires only the gentlest of touches to be made plain. You may bluster, you may threaten, but I prefer to wait a little longer. Human nature cannot resist the relief of confession once it has been cornered." Mrs. Bantry's breath caught audibly, and even Slack seemed subdued by the calm certainty in Miss Marple's tone. The room settled into a waiting hush, the fire crackling softly in the grate. The shadows cast by its light seemed to waver and shift, as though echoing the unease of those present. Miss Marple, serene as ever, knew that the moment was drawing close. The threads she had followed, the ribbon, the forged hand, the destroyed papers, the strained silences were converging. Soon, very soon, the guilty hand would reveal itself, not by force, but by its own faltering attempt at concealment. And when that moment came, she would be ready. The study at Colonel Easterbrook's house was hushed, save for the occasional crackle from the fire and the restless scratching of Inspector Slack's pencil as he tapped it against his notebook. The air felt charged, as though every person in the room awaited a verdict that had not yet been spoken. Edith's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Leonard Copley sat rigid and pale. Mrs. Price Ridley bristled with indignation, and Major Harper loomed by the fireplace with the stiff bearing of a man on parade. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting bag beside her, looked the least imposing of them all. Yet it was her voice, soft, deliberate, that finally broke the silence. "I've always found," she began, "that people imagine deceit requires cleverness. In truth, it requires only the ability to judge how others will react. The Colonel's death was not the result of chance. It was contrived, and very carefully contrived, by someone who understood human weakness." Inspector Slack gave a sharp snort. "Then perhaps you would enlighten us, Miss Marple, since no one else here has chosen to speak plainly." Her eyes twinkled faintly. "In good time, Inspector, but first let us consider what we know. Colonel Easterbrook was found with a telegram in his hand. Not an ordinary telegram, but one dressed up with a velvet ribbon, as though meant for a drawing room rather than a telegraph counter. Its words were vague. Matter of life and death. And yet its effect was immediate. The Colonel collapsed before he could say a word. She glanced at Edith, whose hands twisted her handkerchief. Young Edith has been suspected because she was seen purchasing ribbon and paper. She trembles when asked about the telegram, which to some looks like guilt. But to me, it speaks of fear. Not the fear of being discovered as a forger, but the fear of being blamed for something she cannot control." Mrs. Price Ridley gave a sharp exclamation, but Miss Marple held up her hand. Your daughter's silence is not the silence of guilt, madam. It is the silence of one who knows more than she dares to reveal. Slack leaned forward. And what of the fire? Who set that blaze to the Colonel's papers? Ah, the fire, Miss Marple said gently. A most deliberate act, aimed only at destroying letters. Now, who would fear the contents of those letters being seen? Not young Edith, nor Mr. Copley, but someone whose reputation, perhaps, might suffer. Someone whose pride and career depended on keeping certain matters concealed. Her gaze moved to Major Harper. The soldier stiffened, his face darkening, but Miss Marple's tone remained mild. I do not say you set the blaze, Major, but I do say your agitation whenever the letters are mentioned is most telling. One does not grip a hat brim so fiercely without cause. You feared what those letters might contain, did you not? Not because you wrote them, but because you knew their subject. The Major's lips thinned, and he said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her eyes now sweeping the group. And then, the telegram itself. The handwriting was ornate, almost feminine, certainly not the neat hand of Mr. Copley. The form was missing from much Haddam, where someone had carelessly left behind practice strokes. That practice betrayed the writer's inexperience, the need to disguise their natural hand. A false urgency was created, but dressed in ribbon, as though to soften the blow. It was theater, not efficiency. Edith gave a small cry and buried her face in her hands. Mrs. Price Ridley reached for her, but Miss Marple's voice, still calm, carried over the sound. "My dear Edith," she said gently, "you tied that ribbon, did you not? You thought it would make the dreadful message look less alarming, but the words themselves were not yours. You copied them under instruction. You were frightened, but you obeyed." The girl lifted her tear-streaked face, her lips trembling. "I did not mean harm," she whispered. "I thought it was only a message. I did not know." Mrs. Price Ridley gasped, her outrage faltering into confusion. "Edith, what are you saying?" Inspector Slack pounced. "So she admits it. She wrote the telegram." But Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector. She copied what she was told. The real deceit lay elsewhere." Edith was used, as young people often are, by someone who relied on her timidity to keep her silent afterward. Someone who wished to frighten the Colonel into a shock that his heart could not withstand. The fire crackled. The silence was deep, taut as wire. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her voice lower now, but carrying an authority that filled the room. The hand that forged the telegram is not the hand of innocence, nor of youthful fear. It is the hand of calculation, of one who had reason to silence the Colonel before certain truths could emerge. Those burned letters were the true prize. The telegram was merely the weapon. Her gaze moved once more, resting at last on the figure who had hoped to remain hidden in shadows. And that hand, I believe, sits before us even now. The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into a still pond. No one spoke, but the ripples spread across every face in the room. Edith sobbed softly. Leonard Copley sat in stunned relief. Mrs. Price Ridley gasped in horror, and Major Harper's jaw clenched until the veins stood out on his neck. Inspector Slack straightened in his chair, his eyes darting between them. "Well, Miss Marple? Name the culprit if you dare." But Miss Marple only folded her hands and said, "The truth, Inspector, is now plain. It merely waits for the guilty to acknowledge it. And they will, for human nature is rarely strong enough to resist the weight of its own conscience." The room held its breath. The shadows, which had loomed so heavily, seemed at last to thin, as though the dawn of truth were creeping in. For a moment after Miss Marple's quiet declaration, the room was frozen in silence. The fire in the grate hissed faintly, casting shadows that trembled across the Colonel's desk and the assembled faces. Inspector Slack, pencil poised above his notebook, stared at her with undisguised impatience. "Well, Miss Marple," he demanded, "if the truth is plain, kindly speak it. Who is it you accuse?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly, her eyes fixed on Major Harper. Her voice remained calm, almost apologetic. "It was you, Major. You composed the words of the telegram and persuaded poor Edith to copy them. You knew her timidity would make her compliant, and her silence afterward would be almost certain. You chose the ribbon deliberately, knowing it would soften the dreadful appearance of the message, so that she would not question its nature." And when the Colonel read those ominous words, his heart, already weakened, could not bear the strain. A gasp went round the room. Mrs. Bantry covered her mouth, Leonard Copley looked as though he had been struck, and Mrs. Price Ridley clutched her daughter with a mixture of relief and horror. Major Harper's jaw tightened. His eyes blazed, but he said nothing. Miss Marple went on, her voice still gentle. "You feared what the Colonel might reveal, Major. Those letters he kept locked away. Letters that tied you to a scandal in your regiment many years ago. You were young then, perhaps rash, and the Colonel, loyal to the army, covered for you. But you knew he had kept the evidence, and when you learned he might speak, you resolved to silence him before the matter could surface." Harper drew a sharp breath. "That is speculation," he snapped. "Wild speculation." "Not so wild," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Your presence near the house on the night of the fire was not a mere coincidence. The blaze was set carefully to consume the very papers you dreaded. But fire has a way of leaving traces of ashes enough to show they were personal letters written in a lady's hand. A companion of the Colonel's youth, perhaps, who knew far too much of your own affairs." Edith gave a small cry. "He told me it was only a harmless message. He said it was to help the Colonel, that it would frighten him into calling for a doctor. I thought it was kind." Her mother soothed her with trembling hands, but Miss Marple leaned forward. "You see, Edith's part was innocent enough. She did not know the Colonel's condition. She did not understand that a sudden shock could be fatal. But you, Major, you knew. You counted on it." Inspector Slack slammed his notebook shut with a thud. "So that's it, then. By heaven, I suspected the wrong ones all along. Clever, Harper. Too clever by half, but the lady has seen through you." Harper's face was drained of color. His shoulders sagged, the soldierly bearing crumbling at last. "The Colonel would have ruined me," he said hoarsely. "My career, my name, it would all have been destroyed. I thought it was only to frighten him, not to kill. I never meant," but his voice faltered. The words rang hollow in the dim study. Miss Marple's expression was one of quiet sadness. "One rarely means the worst, Major, but once set in motion, events seldom unfold as we intend. That is why deception is always so perilous." Slack barked orders. The constable stepped forward, and within minutes, Major Harper was led from the room, his head bowed. The case that had gripped Saint Mary Mead for weeks had reached its bitter climax. In the days that followed, the village hummed with talk. Some said the Major was a villain through and through, others that he was a tragic figure, undone by pride and fear. Edith, poor child, became the object of sympathy at last, though she shrank from every kind word. Leonard Copley walked with his head higher, though he avoided the blue boar, unwilling to hear the muttered apologies of those who had maligned him. Mrs. Price Ridley, though relieved at her daughter's innocence, never quite forgave the village for its suspicion. She carried herself with renewed hauteur, but her eyes betrayed a lingering bitterness. Through it all, Miss Marple went quietly about her days. She tended her garden, visited neighbors, and resumed her knitting in the EI parlor window. When Mrs. Bantry came to call, eager as always for detail, Miss Marple only smiled. "It is curious, is it not?" she mused, "how people reveal themselves." The Colonel's death was not so much a mystery of means as of motives. The telegram, the ribbon, the fire, they were but signs of a deeper truth. Pride, fear, and the desire to keep a past misdeed hidden. Such things weigh heavier on a man than any burden of proof. Mrs. Bantry shivered delightfully. "And to think you saw it all, Jane. while the inspector blustered about the poor clerk and Edith. "It is almost uncanny." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles flashing in the lamplight. "Not uncanny, my dear. Only observation. People are very much alike, you know, whether in a small village or the wide world. They tell you everything if you only know how to listen." And with that, she bent once more to her knitting, the pattern unfolding beneath her hands as neatly and inevitably as the truth had unfolded in Colonel Easterbrook's study. The village of St. Mary Mead returned to its routines, though with a sharper awareness that beneath every polite smile, every carefully folded letter, and every velvet ribbon, there might lie secrets waiting to be revealed.